Picture a coastline that no longer exists. Somewhere beneath the North Sea, that gray, unremarkable body of water sitting between Britain and mainland Europe that you probably associate with offshore wind farms and ferry crossings, there is a drowned landscape. Hills and valleys, river channels, lake beds, forests, an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom, now sitting under approximately 40 meters of seawater, that was once home to tens of thousands of human beings who hunted, fished, built shelters, raised children, buried their dead, and lived complete human lives in a place that the modern world has entirely forgotten because the modern world cannot see it. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, and it didn't disappear slowly, the way continents drift or mountains erode. It disappeared within a human timescale, possibly within living memory of the people who experienced it. The rising seas of the post-glacial world were already swallowing its margins over centuries, pushing communities gradually inland, shrinking the habitable territory year by year. And then, approximately 8,200 years ago, something catastrophic happened that may have accelerated that process dramatically. A submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, displaced an enormous volume of water and sent a tsunami crashing across what remained of Doggerland, with waves potentially reaching heights of several meters. The people living there at that moment had no warning system, no satellites, no seismographs, no emergency broadcast network interrupting whatever the Mesolithic equivalent of a quiet evening was. What they had was the sudden, inexplicable withdrawal of coastal water, the sea pulling back in the eerie, unnatural way it does before a tsunami arrives, and whatever happened next depended entirely on whether anyone present recognized that withdrawal for what it was, and whether there was anywhere higher to run in time. Some of them survived. We know this because their descendants are us. But the story of how ancient humans navigated not just this event, but the entire epoch of catastrophic flooding that reshaped the planet at the end of the last ice age is one of the most dramatic, most consequential, and most underappreciated survival stories in the history of our species. To understand the scale of what ancient humans were dealing with, you need to understand what the end of the last glacial maximum actually meant in physical terms, because the numbers are almost difficult to process at a human scale. At the peak of the last ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. These ice sheets were not modest affairs. The Laurentide ice sheet covering North America was in places more than 3 kilometers thick. 3 kilometers. The weight of that ice was sufficient to depress the bedrock beneath it by hundreds of meters. Greenland still hasn't fully rebounded from the ice it lost thousands of years ago. The land is still slowly rising. All of that ice represented water, enormous, incomprehensible quantities of water, locked in frozen form on land rather than flowing into the ocean. At the glacial maximum, global sea levels were approximately 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. To put that in perspective, that's low enough to walk from Britain to France on dry land, from Siberia to Alaska across the Bering Land Bridge, from mainland Southeast Asia to what are now the islands of Indonesia across an exposed continental shelf called Sundaland. The world's geography was profoundly, fundamentally different from the one we inhabit. And then it started warming, beginning around 18,000 years ago and continuing through a complex, non-linear process over the following 10,000 years. The ice melted. Sea levels rose, not at a constant rate, but in pulses driven by periodic surges of meltwater from collapsing ice sheets. The most dramatic of these pulses, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,500 years ago and may have raised global sea levels by as much as 15 to 20 meters in just a few centuries. Other pulses followed. The overall trend was relentless and ultimately irreversible. The coasts of the world were retreating inland at varying rates, swallowing the low-lying territories that had been home to human populations throughout the glacial period, the humans. Dealing with this were not primitive creatures cowering in caves. By 14,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans had been behaviorally sophisticated for tens of thousands of years. They had complex social structures, accumulated ecological knowledge passed down through generations, symbolic thought, long-distance trade networks, and a demonstrated capacity for adapting to environmental change that had already seen them colonize environments from tropical forests to Arctic tundra. What they did not have was any framework for understanding what was happening at a geological level, or any way of knowing whether the flooding would ever stop. The Bering Land Bridge is one of the most consequential pieces of real estate in human history, and its story is entirely tied to the flooding of the post-glacial world. At the glacial maximum, the exposed continental shelf connecting Siberia to Alaska, a region called Beringia, was not a narrow land bridge but a broad, habitable landmass potentially 1,500 kilometers wide from north to south. It had its own climate, its own ecosystems, its own populations of megafauna including woolly mammoths, bison, and horses. And it had people, human populations who had moved progressively eastward from Siberia and established themselves in Beringia over thousands of years. As sea levels rose, Beringia began to shrink. The flooding came from both sides, the Pacific and the Arctic, gradually narrowing the exposed land, and eventually, around 11,000 years ago, completing the separation of the continents that exists today. The people who had crossed into Alaska before that closure became the founding populations of the Americas, completely cut off from their ancestral homeland by water, with no knowledge that an entire hemisphere lay to the south awaiting exploration. How did the people of Beringia survive the flooding of their homeland? The same way coastal populations worldwide survived similar inundations, by moving, by retreating to higher ground as the water advanced, by following game animals that were themselves retreating to remaining habitable territory, by maintaining the social cohesion and ecological knowledge that allowed communities to establish themselves in new environments. The archaeological record of Beringia itself is largely inaccessible. It's underwater now, which creates a frustrating gap in our understanding of what those populations looked like and how they lived in the period immediately before the Americas were colonized. This is one of the recurring challenges of studying post-glacial flooding. The evidence is often precisely where we can't easily reach it. Sundaland presents a parallel story on the other side of the world, and one with potentially enormous implications for understanding the peopling of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. At the glacial maximum, the islands of what are now Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and the intervening smaller islands were connected to mainland Southeast Asia by a broad, lowland continental shelf. This exposed landmass, Sundaland, was considerably larger than any of the modern islands derived from it and supported substantial human populations. The rivers that now flow off those islands into the sea were once tributaries of larger river systems draining the Sundaland interior. As sea levels rose, Sundaland drowned in stages over thousands of years. The final inundation brought the geography to approximately its modern configuration by around 8,000 years ago, fragmenting what had been a continuous land surface into the archipelago of islands we see today. The populations caught in this fragmentation were separated from each other and from mainland populations, with some being isolated on islands, others retreating onto the mainland, and others potentially developing the maritime technology necessary to maintain connections across the growing water gaps. There is a compelling argument, supported by genetic and linguistic evidence, that this flooding-driven fragmentation played a significant role in the remarkable linguistic and cultural diversity of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. When populations are separated by water, they diverge. Languages evolve independently. Cultural traditions branch. Over thousands of years, the communities scattered by the drowning of Sundaland became the ancestors of extraordinarily diverse populations spread from Madagascar to Easter Island, connected by genetic heritage and by a maritime tradition that may have its roots in the practical necessity of crossing the waters that had drowned their shared homeland. The Black Sea floods occupy a particularly contested but fascinating corner of the post-glacial flooding story, and they connect directly to one of the most widespread and persistent narrative traditions in all of human culture. The hypothesis, first proposed by oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s, goes roughly as follows. At the end of the last ice age, the Black Sea was not a sea, but a large freshwater lake, its surface sitting well below the level of the Mediterranean Sea, and separated from it by a natural sill at the location of the modern Bosphorus Strait. As Mediterranean sea levels rose following glacial melt, they eventually reached the height of that sill, and the sill gave way. The resulting influx of salt water into the freshwater lake would have been dramatic. Mediterranean water poured through the breach at high velocity, rapidly raising Black Sea water levels and flooding the lake's margins. The lake's shoreline, which had been home to human settlements supported by its freshwater resources and the productive ecosystem surrounding it, was inundated. Settlements were swallowed. Agricultural communities that had established themselves on the lake's shores during the relatively stable period before the flood were displaced. Whether this event happened as catastrophically and rapidly as Ryan and Pittman initially suggested remains debated. Subsequent research has complicated the picture significantly. The timing, the rate of flooding, and the extent of human settlement on the pre-flood shoreline are all matters of active scientific discussion. But the core geological fact that the Black Sea basin was dramatically transformed by post-glacial sea level rise is well established. Something happened there, something large and consequential, and the communities living around the ancient lake basin experienced it. The connection that Ryan, Pittman, and various subsequent researchers have proposed that this flooding event, or events like it across the region, may have contributed to the nearly universal human tradition of flood mythology, is speculative but not unreasonable. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written narrative in human history, contains a detailed flood story. A man warned by a deity of an impending catastrophic flood, building a vessel, loading it with animals and his family, surviving the flood, and emerging into a transformed world. The structural parallels to flood narratives from cultures worldwide are striking enough that many scholars have looked for a common experiential route, a real flood event, or series of events, so traumatic that memory of them persisted through oral tradition across thousands of years. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This brings up one of the most extraordinary aspects of the ancient flooding story: the evidence that oral traditions may preserve memory of real geological events across timescales that most people would consider impossible for oral transmission. In Australia, Aboriginal communities maintain oral traditions about a time when the sea was much further away, when landmarks now underwater were dry land, when the coastline sat far beyond its current position. Researchers comparing these traditions to geological reconstructions of sea level rise have found correspondences suggesting that some Aboriginal oral traditions may preserve accurate geographical memory of coastal conditions from more than 7,000 years ago, possibly considerably older. 7,000 years of oral transmission. Dozens of generations of storytellers passing accurate geographical information that could only be verified by oceanographic research conducted in the 20th and 21st centuries, through an unbroken chain of memory. The stories described specific locations, specific geographical features, specific conditions that could be checked against what we now know about ancient sea levels. And in multiple cases, they checked out. This changes the way we should think about flood mythology worldwide. The stories of ancient floods that appear in the traditions of cultures on every inhabited continent may not be purely symbolic or theological constructions. They may be documentary records, imprecise by the standards of written history, shaped by the narrative conventions and cosmological frameworks of the cultures that preserved them, but grounded in the actual experience of actual people watching actual water rise and swallow the landscapes they had lived in for generations. How did they survive? The question demands more than the simple answer of "they moved," because moving under these conditions was neither simple nor free of cost. Coastal populations during post-glacial flooding were not facing a single dramatic event followed by stability. They were facing a process that operated at multiple timescales simultaneously. Over centuries and millennia, the overall trend was relentless inundation, coastlines retreating, lowland territories disappearing, islands shrinking. Within that long trend, shorter period events, tsunamis, storm surges, rapid meltwater pulses, created sudden crises superimposed on the chronic stress of ongoing sea level rise. And the human response had to operate at both timescales, adapting culturally and technologically to a world where coastlines were unreliable over the long term, while also surviving acute events in real time. Migration was the primary adaptive response, and it required the social infrastructure to execute it successfully. A community that could move needed somewhere to move to. It needed relationships with populations in higher elevation territories, either existing relationships that allowed them to be absorbed, or the capacity to establish new territories through negotiation or conflict. It needed to carry with it the knowledge base, ecological, technological, social, that would allow it to function in new environments. Communities that lacked these resources, or that were geographically trapped without retreat options, faced potentially catastrophic outcomes. The evidence suggests that maritime technology, watercraft, played an increasingly important role as flooding progressed. Populations that developed the ability to navigate water had options unavailable to those who didn't. They could maintain connections across widening water gaps. They could scout new territories. They could transport people and goods across flooded terrain that would otherwise be impassable. The correlation between post-glacial flooding and apparent expansions of maritime activity in the archaeological record is not coincidental. Necessity is a reliable driver of technological innovation, and flooding creates maritime necessity at scale. The 8.2 kilo-year event deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most dramatic climate disruptions of the entire post-glacial period, and one that human populations worldwide felt acutely. Around 8,200 years ago, the final drainage of two massive glacial lakes, Lake Agassiz and Lake Ojibwe, in North America released an enormous pulse of cold freshwater into the North Atlantic. The volume was staggering. Estimates suggest the equivalent of several times the volume of modern Lake Superior discharged into the ocean over a relatively short period. This freshwater influx disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the ocean current system that transports heat northward and significantly moderates temperatures across the North Atlantic region and Europe. The result was a rapid cooling event that lowered temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere by several degrees and lasted approximately 150 to 200 years. Simultaneously, it contributed to a rapid pulse of sea level rise as the meltwater entered the global ocean, affecting coastlines worldwide. In the North Atlantic region, the combination of flooding and rapid cooling created acute stress for human populations already adapting to post-glacial environmental change. This is the period around which Doggerland's final submergence likely occurred, and the Storegga tsunami may have happened during or shortly after this event. The people of the North Sea region were dealing with a convergence of challenges: ongoing sea level rise swallowing their territory, a cooling event disrupting the ecological productivity they depended on, and potentially a tsunami event that struck remaining low-lying inhabited areas. The population movements associated with this period, visible in the archaeological record as shifts in settlement patterns, changes in material culture, and genetic signatures of population displacement, represent one of the most significant reorganizations of human populations in post-glacial European history. Communities that had occupied coastal and lowland territories for generations were displaced into higher ground, compressing into territories already occupied by other groups, creating pressures that drove both conflict and the intensification of resource use that may have contributed to the adoption of agriculture in some regions. There is a genuinely profound insight buried in the timing of one of humanity's most transformative developments. Agriculture emerged in the period immediately following the most dramatic phase of post-glacial flooding. The Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, widely regarded as one of the primary centers of early agricultural development, shows evidence of plant and animal domestication beginning around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, precisely during the period when post-glacial sea level rise was dramatically reshinking coastal and lowland habitable territory across the region. This is probably not coincidental. The flooding of the post-glacial world compressed human populations into higher elevation territories. It reduced the total area of productive coastal and lowland habitat, some of the most ecologically productive environments available to hunter-gatherer communities. The combination of population pressure and habitat reduction created selection pressure for more intensive food production strategies. When you can't expand geographically, you intensify where you are. When coastlines that once supported communities with fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and coastal plant resources are underwater, the communities displaced from them need new strategies for feeding themselves in less productive inland environments. Agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of plants and management of animals to increase food production per unit of land area, is precisely the kind of intensification strategy that becomes advantageous when land is scarce and population pressure is high. The flooding of the post-glacial world may have been one of the environmental drivers that pushed human populations towards the agricultural transition, making one of the most consequential developments in human history, partly a consequence of ancient people trying to survive the biggest flooding event their world had ever seen. The genetic evidence has added extraordinary resolution to this story over the past 2 decades. Ancient DNA extracted from human remains across the post-glacial period has allowed researchers to trace population movements with a precision that archaeological inference alone could never achieve, identifying when populations moved, where they came from, and how they mixed with existing communities. What this evidence shows is a world in motion. Populations displaced by flooding moving into contact with established highland communities. Genetic mixing events correlating with the timing of known flooding pulses. The founding populations of regions that had been connected by dry land during the glacial period diverging as the waters separated them. The descendants of Doggerland's inhabitants, identifiable through their genetic signatures, appearing in the British Isles and mainland European populations as the sea level rose, and migration reshaped the regional population structure. The flooding didn't just displace people geographically, it drove the mixing of previously separate populations, creating new genetic combinations and new cultural syntheses. In the long sweep of human evolutionary history, post-glacial flooding was one of the great engines of human diversity, forcing contact between populations that geographic barriers had previously kept separate, driving the cultural and genetic mixing that produced much of the variation we observe in modern human populations worldwide. The world those ancient communities inhabited during the peak flooding period was profoundly disorienting in ways that go beyond the physical challenge of rising water. The landscape of their childhood was not the landscape of their adulthood. Landmarks their grandparents had described were underwater. Routes that had been passable within living memory were drowned. The coastline, that fundamental geographical anchor for coastal communities, was a moving target, unreliable across a human lifetime in ways that no fixed landscape feature is supposed to be. And yet they adapted. The evidence of their survival is everywhere. In the genetic diversity of modern human populations, in the archaeological record of settlement, shifts, and technological innovation, in the oral traditions that preserved memory of drowned landscapes thousands of years after the water rose, in the agricultural revolution that reshaped human civilization in the post-glacial world. They moved when they had to. They innovated when they had to. They carried their knowledge, their culture, their social bonds through circumstances that would test the adaptive capacity of any species. The floods came, the coasts retreated, the familiar world drowned. And the people who had built their lives on those coasts did what human beings have always done when the environment delivers something intolerable. They survived it. Not all of them. Not without cost. Not without loss of community, of territory, of the particular ways of life that specific landscapes had made possible. But enough of them. Enough to carry forward the accumulated knowledge and genetic heritage that eventually produced every human being alive on Earth today. Doggerland is still down there, under 40 meters of the North Sea. Occasionally, a fishing trawler drags up a mammoth tooth or a piece of worked antler, physical artifacts from a world that vanished beneath the waves 8,000 years ago, hauled briefly back into the light before going back where they came from. The people who made those objects are gone in every sense except the most important one. They are gone, and we are here, and the distance between those two facts is the distance that survival crosses.